Jim Johnson, welcome to the journey. And let me just share a little bit about what the journey is. The journey is a show that really talks about the concept and the ideas of transformation. How does a person have struggles in their life and take those struggles and then transform into maybe who God or their higher power designed them to be, or how they, with certain setbacks, how did they recreate themselves or fail forward? And I know a few months ago you shared a little bit about your story to me, and you've been now at KP for about 9 months, and you've been doing a great job with uh, helping clients and a huge part of our team now. So I just wanted to have you on the show and kind of have you share a little bit about your story. But before we jump into all that, when Jim has an opportunity for some fun, what do you do for fun, Jim?
Um, well, I've been really enjoying time with my wife, and we've been, even with uh, sheltering in place, we've been riding our bicycles, been going up to Madison, and they have the lake loop up there. It's a 15-mile ride. That's been a lot of my self-care. It's
Okay.
kind of an every weekend thing. Um, Gives us a hour and a half to talk on the way up there, an hour
Okay.
and a half. It's just been a good time, and um, I love animals. That's kind of my first love, and I train border collies
Oh, okay.
for sheepdog trials and stock dog trials, and so that's one of the ways I kind of get away and have a little bit of fun. There's still kind of this part of me that I don't know, like a little edge. I got a motorcycle, and I bought a boat, and so I feed that side of myself a little bit every now and then.
Sure, sure. Okay. How long have you been into with breeding and raising dogs? Or train you breed and raise them and train them, or
I'm mostly training now. It started probably 15 years ago, and then there was some. My son was ill for a while, and it kind of went by the wayside for a while. But the last 3 years, I've kind of been ramping up a little bit and got a new dog, and I have another new dog on the way that are hopefully going to be potentially I can start breeding them and moving forward from there. So the last 2 or 3 years, I've kind of definitely gotten back into it.
okay.
Once I got done with my graduate work, that freed up a little time too to kind of get back into it.
Sure, sure. So your wife's name is
Peggy,
Peggy, and how long have you and Peggy been together?
we've been married 30 years, and it started actually we started dating in high school, so I've probably known her 36 years.
Okay, all right, okay. And does Peg work outside the home, or what does Peg do?
Yeah, she works at a bank. She's a chief financial officer at a bank.
Okay, all right.
She was a
And it,
CPA first, and now she's in banking.
gotcha. Okay, and you have kids. How many kids do you have?
I have a daughter, Caitlin, who's 27 years old, and she is a nurse at Swedes.
Okay,
She just had a baby 6 weeks ago,
okay,
named Cam. Um, and then I have a late son who passed away in 2010.
okay, okay. I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah,
So and then and Cam, right, is your grandson,
right.
correct? Okay, and so this is the first grandbaby.
Right.
Okay, okay.
Yep. Caitlin actually married a guy that we actually like a lot, and his name is Brandon. So
Okay.
yeah, so we that's kind of our Brandon's kind of become a kid too. Um,
Okay. Sure, sure. How long have they been together?
3 years now.
Okay. All right. Well,
4. I'm sorry, 4. I got told yesterday.
okay. All right. I can resemble that. I do the same thing. I have to figure out certain milestones to remember how long the relationships have been going.
Yeah.
So I know that you told me that before you were a counselor, there was a whole nother life that you were career that you were involved with, and so what did you first start with, or maybe even before we jump into that, where you're from, where are you from?
I live over between Winnebago and Seward.
Okay. Okay.
Winnebago School District, but we live out in the country on a farm.
Gotcha.
And
And
then
so,
I grew up just like 2.5 miles west of where I live now. So those two farms kind of acted together. My dad lives on the other one.
gotcha. Okay. And so you grew up on the farm, and that was part of your life growing up, right?
Yep.
So yeah, so tell us a little bit. What was that like growing up on the farm, growing, and then you did farming for a while as well, correct?
Yeah, I farmed with, so I grew up on a farm and we raised corn, soybeans. We had cattle and hogs for quite a few years. It kind of developed more into the hog side as far as the livestock side goes. I loved it from day one. I was a kid that got up with my dad every morning I could and was out there, not because he made me, because I liked being out there with him. I went to the University of Illinois in agriculture, animal science, kind of with my preference being towards veterinary science more than the production side, just because I felt like I could learn the production side from my dad. So, which I did. So, came back, farmed with him for, I think we farmed together for 20 years.
Oh wow.
And about, I think it was the early 90s, middle 90s, the prices for our livestock got really bad. So I built a small meat processing place to try to capitalize on some of that, kind of cut out the middleman a little bit. So I was involved with both of those businesses.
Okay. So then, and so then you, so from that aspect of being I'm guessing an element of being an entrepreneur, right? Where did that really come from? The entrepreneur aspect of it? Because jumping into that meat processing piece, that was a little bit. It's not a huge stretch from raising livestock, but it's nonetheless it's a different. It's out of the normal groove. So how
Yeah.
did that all come about?
Um, I guess I just kind of saw the writing on the wall that the agriculture industry, the way it was, that we weren't going to be big enough to survive the way we were. We didn't have enough capital to just keep building and building to, so I felt like, okay, if I'm gonna, and to be honest with you, Kevin, I think part of it was based in fear.
Okay,
It's because I was terrified in not being in that farm environment, like not being, it's all I had ever known. I loved it.
sure,
And so I think it was kind of a, okay, I got to do something different here to try to preserve this. And so I think that's kind of what led to taking the leap. And my dad has always been supportive. I mean, not supportive like do whatever, but supportive if it was something that could better us. He was always an innovator.
sure.
Um, so I think it kind of came from that too.
Well, I think it's interesting that you talked about mid '90s and the livestock, the price of livestock was taking a different turn. The business as a whole, the industry as a whole was starting to shift, right? And as you were seeing this unfolding and seeing the how you guys were doing stuff, there was a vulnerability, and you were looking at how to pivot and how to adapt, right?
Right.
And
Trying to find a way.
what's that?
Yes, I'm sorry. Just trying to find a way, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I think right now with everything going on with what's happening with the pandemic of COVID and there's a lot of businesses right now that are, I mean, I don't know of a business that isn't getting impacted, right? So every business is getting impacted, and for some it's going to be just like you did back in the 90s. How are you going to it in and fear is an energizer, right? You can be energized by fear or you can be paralyzed by it. And if you get energized by looking at movement, that energy's got to come from somewhere. And to be able to figure out how do we become innovative, how do we adapt, um, how do we look at ways of possibly adding to the business or doing the business more efficiently or something like that, I think is key during these time periods. How did that work for that time period, and kind of tell us a little bit about what happened then as you started going into the processing piece of it, what did that do with the business? How did that help? How did it not help? What did you learn from it?
Um, I guess the coolest thing about it was I maintained the family interactions. It's like we kind of came into it with that same family mentality. And I think in hindsight, even, I mean, I think I was conscious of it at the time, but I think especially in hindsight, we got to do it as a family. I can remember at Christmas time was obviously a big time, um, with the meat stuff. And I had my nieces that came and helped, and I grew closer to them. And there was some really cool aspects from it from that point. But from a financial standpoint, it was difficult. Like we couldn't ever quite get over that hump of, um and I guess the other part of it was the production side. We weren't selling enough through the meat store to that matched all of our production. So we were still getting hurt on the remainder of our production that wasn't going through the store.
Sure. Gotcha.
So, but there were the advantages were, like I said, Dad and I were together actually probably more because we were both working up there as well. So,
Okay. Okay. So one of the core things that you wanted the business to do was to be able to not only provide a living, but then also to provide that family experience, that family unity, and continue to work from that end. It may not have been the thing that was going to create some huge legacy or retirement, but it was going to be able to you know to 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 keep the family as a whole going together.
right.
Gotcha. Okay. And I think that's kind of key too right now. I've talked to a lot of people who own restaurants right now, and how are they adapting and pivoting during this time period when they can't have their customers dine indoors. And when they do, when that happens, when the dining does open up, what's that going to look like? Or do we not open up and do we just stick with carryout? And I was talking to a couple different people about different ways of changing and adapting and trying different things now.
Yeah. And I think it's facing that fear. And to be honest with you, like that fear is what can keep you in too long. Does that make sense? It's like you talked about fear being a motivator. And so I know for me, just being honest, like I feared so much not having that family unit, not working as a family unit. Um, but the irony is, I guess, now is that when I can look at it sitting here today, and my family's still as close as we ever were.
Sure. Yeah.
And things have changed quite a bit up
Yeah.
till now. So I guess from a hope standpoint, like it's kind of separating that I can be with family, I can be content with family, despite what a family business, how it may change or develop. And
Sure. Sure. Yeah. And I think, it's interesting when you talk about that, that fear can be, a motivator to adapt and change. It also can be a fear can cause us to dig our heels in and refuse to change, right? That we stick around for too long. And I know for me, there's been time periods in my life where I saw the writing on the wall. I knew that my time at this particular, this particular career or this particular activity, and I stuck around too long because who would I be if I stopped doing this activity or stopped doing this thing? And there was a lot of concerns, and I know sometimes we even talk about in addiction that people will stay with a pattern of addictive pattern of behavior or substance or whatever, and it's because of the fear of who I be if I stop. And so they know it's done, they know it's over, but they stick around because of that fear.
right, who am I going to be if I stop?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, why don't you kind of fast forward to what did and inevitably what happened with the family business, with the farm, and tell us a little bit about how that story transitioned for you, because I know that there was a transition for you. So why don't you kind of fast forward us with that?
Well, so 2002, so we built the meat business in 1999. 2002, we were in a very, just my immediate family. So it was me, my wife, my daughter, and my son. My son was 5. My daughter was 10 at the time. A 16-year-old kid blew a stop sign, hit us. My son and I were very badly hurt. In the midst of, did I say it was 2002? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you
It
said
was
two.
about 3 years into the meat, when the meat business had started. Um, I was in the hospital for a few weeks, and I think you talked about addiction. I already kind of had an addictive personality a little bit, I think, and ended up getting hooked on the pain meds from the accident. My son, at 5 years old, when they were doing the CAT scans from the accident, they discovered a tumor. So as soon as he got healed up from the accident, we were right up to Madison to start working on that. And so for me, Mr. Family, Mr. Control Freak, try to keep everything, you know, right where I wanted and keep it safe. That all kind of got blown up, kind of all in one day. Um, so he went on to fight cancer for 8 years after that. Um, and it was a definitely developmental time for me. I got clean about a year later, probably, and got myself help. And I still feel incredibly blessed that I was there for those years of his life at 100%.
Mhm.
But I realized, and like, you mentioned before, like the meat store did fine, but I just could see the writing on the wall. I didn't necessarily see this being like are we gonna work this hard for this amount of income the rest of our life? And I was just awestruck with the people at UW at the Children's Hospital. Just I felt like they gave us as parents even more than they gave my son Ben. And I mean, they treated him amazingly. And it started to kind of fuel this fire, I think, that was always in me to take that risk, to help people, to be there in the tough times, to be there when it might be scary for other people, because I had kind of had to face that myself. So I talked to Dad one day. I still remember it. I don't know if he does. And I just said, Dad, I feel like, you know, to I need to do this. And I had known from volunteering at Rosecrans that if I was going to do anything in the mental health field, first of all, I wanted to be good at it or know I could actually help. And the other part I knew was you're going to have graduate education to do it. So I went to school over the course for my graduate degree over the course of about 5 years because I was working full time. Um, in the midst of all that, we sold the meat store, transitioned the farm out where we got out of the livestock and rented out the land. And then I started out working at Rosecrans, and that kind of, once I completed my graduate degree, um, my son actually passed away. I think it was 3 weeks before I started my graduate degree. So I kind of developed, that was kind of part of my growth there too. So, and now that's kind of through that process, um, I got here.
Okay. So, and I apologize. Your son's first name? Your
Ben.
son? Ben. So Ben died in 2010, and prior, you started the graduate program 3 weeks before he
I guess
died.
it was 3 months after he died in April, and then I started in August of that
Okay.
year.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
And I also started at Rosecrans. So for 1 year, I was running the business and working at Rosecrans full time
Okay.
and going to one class. I wasn't like full time at
Right.
school, but
Okay. Okay.
so we kind of made that whole transition. We transitioned to life without Ben not farming, and going to school all within kind of that same year.
Sure, sure. So going back to the journey of Ben having, because it's kind of a unique, well, I don't know if it's unique or not. I mean, it sounds unique to me, but so you guys get into a car accident in 2002, right? But Ben, for all sakes and purposes, wasn't sick, nothing was wrong or anything like this, right?
Right.
And so, but because of the MRI or the CAT scans he had to have because of the accident, they discovered this tumor. If they wouldn't have discovered the tumor at that time, let's say the accident never happened, what any speculation on what that would have been like?
Well, that was kind of the challenge, is that obviously first we thought, um, God swooped in, saved us. Like, what if we wouldn't have found the tumor? This gave us an opportunity to take care of it. It was small at the time. It was only stage 2. It was the disease is neuroblastoma, and it's almost always stage 2 when they catch it, because it grows on nerves, and it started on his adrenal gland, and so it had just gotten into one lymph node. But the thing that I didn't realize till now is that kids can often fight these cancers off. And at the time, the tumor was actually half benign and half malignant.
Okay.
So his body was already starting to fight it off.
Okay.
So now we're not sure if the trauma from the accident might have actually got it going more, even though they removed the tumor, but
Okay.
we'll never know.
Sure,
So,
sure. Okay. So it's one of those things where in one hand, it obviously it was a trauma and tragedy, and then it could be seen as a blessing, and then later with more information, it, we just don't know, right?
right.
And I think that you said something earlier about someone who wants to have answers or wants to be able to dictate what answer I'm going to pick, A, B, or C. This is going to drive it crazy sometimes, right?
Always.
And and I think that is, I think sometimes when when people are struggling and is recognizing that we can't control the outcome necessarily. We can just control the choices we're making along the journey. And that whole process of what ifing ourselves after something happens um will drive us crazy. So if you could, and I know this is maybe a hard question, but if there was one thing that you learned about yourself going through that experience of being a father with his son having cancer, what would be something that you learned about yourself that you wouldn't have learned if you wouldn't have gone through that?
um, I guess the number one thing is that I learned how much we can still find joy in a really difficult time. And I'll be honest that I realize it more now. I'm not saying I had all this insight when I was going through it,
Sure.
but I realize now that what it taught me more than anything else is, number one, I mentioned that I was so fearful of leaving home or the family unit, because we had such a strong family unit. And then it was kind of like, I kind of had wow, God, if you couldn't have hit me any harder, then you go ahead and take my son. But what I actually realized is maybe the gift and I think the rest of my family would speak to this to some extent, the gift that we got was that the thing we thought was the worst thing that could possibly happen, and not that it wasn't awful, didn't kill us. We're still okay. We're still finding joy. And I think that's kind of how I try to help clients. And it's kind of become my motto, is that life's going to be hard. Like, we're going to, you said choosing the next deciding to live instead of deciding to be stagnant, or deciding to live instead of deciding to be paralyzed in fear. I think sometimes people get caught up thinking that that means that I'm just not supposed to care, or I'm not, that wasn't supposed to hurt, or that that grief. No, that doesn't. You still are going to have to feel the pain. You're still going to have to feel fear. But will I allow myself to actually have joy at the same time?
Mhm.
Will I allow myself to look down, look under door number 3? And am I willing to risk being happy? Am I willing to risk that this isn't going to be the end, and that there is another way to live? And it's that, getting past, I know you've talked about Brene Brown, and I think she calls it the hustle, right? Like trying to appear like I'm fine and that I'm dealing with everything okay. And I think the biggest gift I got from Ben was that, first of all, he did really well at just taking every day that he had and doing the best he could with it. So I had that teacher. And now it's just like, hey, do I watch the news? Of course. Am I fearful that I can't do some of the fun things that I love to do? Of course I am. Am I fearful for my family? Of course I am. But I'm not, I know we'll get through it. I choose to be happy today. I choose to just kind of take what comes. I can feel the pain and I know I'm not going to die, but then am I willing to let myself feel some joy at the same time?
Sure. Yeah. And I think it's the tension in that, right? It's living in that, and risking, and because to really live, experiencing pain and fear at the same time, being open to experience joy, that there's a vulnerability that you have to choose to be open to do that, to do both, because so many times want to say, nope, I don't want to feel anymore, and so we choose to be closed, as if somehow that's going to stop suffering from happening. it,
Right.
it it doesn't, and it doesn't necessarily stop another brick getting thrown on the pile either. So a couple things real quick before we jump onto a different topic. um, I, I I want to hear about, like, if you were going to describe Ben in because when Ben, so Ben was, when he died, he was 13.
13.
13,
Yep.
okay. So describe, if you could describe for us, who's Ben, what was Ben like? If you describe Ben, what was Ben like?
He was so Caitlin was the child, my daughter, that you could give her a dirty look and she'd cry. Like, I mean, you just, always wanted to please, blah, blah, blah. Well, Ben was the second child and he had a little more fire. He was kind of scrappy, kind of spunky. And he just, obviously he matured beyond his years, but he kind of took that personality. And I remember he would talk to the doctors and nurses like they loved him, and they loved taking care of him. And he just, he was the kid that if you were around him, instead of making you sad, he was always inspiring you. And I'm not just saying that because he's my son. Like, it's really how it was. He had a group of friends they're all now, I think, 24, and they actually called themselves Team Ben back when they were in middle school. But they were all there. They gathered together when we knew he was going to pass away, and they were all there. Like, nobody ever ran away from him. And I remember they started a bullying campaign at Winnebago, and I think they do something like that every year now. But it was one of the first ones, and I mean, he didn't like to talk in front of people, and he didn't want sympathy or anything. And he was actually quite sick at the time, but he actually got up in front of the eighth grade to share with the whole middle school how important Make-A-Wish was to him and how much that had done for him. And when he was passionate about something, he would sacrifice to um, do what he had to do.
Wow. Well, yeah, I'm guessing just by that comment about the young men who knew him and got to experience life with him. Uh, I imagine that Ben's legacy lives with them now, in different ways because of those developmental years that they spent with him.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, he definitely impacted everybody. I can remember even when we were up at Madison, when they finally had kind of given us the news there was nothing more they were going to be able to do, that one of the nurses that had taken care of him, I think for the last 5 years of his life, came in, and even on her, they had called her and she came in on her day off to talk to him. So, I mean, that was the kind of impact he had.
Sure, sure. Well, I can definitely tell just as being a proud father of two. My son is Ben's age, 24 right now, and then my daughter being 21. You definitely are a proud dad of both your kids. I know a proud grandpa too right now, but I can definitely hear that pride when you talk about Ben. Not only how he lived pre um, uh, finding out he has cancer, but then living with the cancer.
Hmm.
Jim, if there was going to be something, if and I think I've asked you this question before regarding a different project that I was doing, but if there was something that you were going to tell either a father or a parent that's going through this, meaning either a child or adult child or a child with cancer, what would be something that you would want them to know based upon what you've gone through?
I guess one of the main things I had the gift of um, a set of friends, and they all know who they are, who I needed, like, you need to talk about it. You need to have a safe place where it's just, I can be honest about how bad it hurts. I can be honest about how scared I am. Um, because if I, if I don't get honest with those feelings, then I don't get to be present. There was one time in particular. So we were about halfway through. So we probably had been sick for about 4 years. And I think we were spending from a third to half the year in the hospital each year, just because he was pretty much, he was never in remission. So he was always on some type of treatment. So my wife and I would switch off, and because we never let him be there alone. And so the weekends would be the only time we would really get to see each other much other than in passing when he was in the hospital. So somebody would usually visit on the weekends. And for people that don't know it, the UW hospital is right on Lake Mendota up there. And there's a walking path for like that the students use and stuff where you can walk along the lake. So generally when somebody would come visit, my wife and I would have a chance to go out and walk along the lake. And we would spend most of our time talking about, okay, I think, Dr. Pachetti said this, and we got labs every morning. And, you kind of become a nurse by the time you get done with something like this. And we would try to convince each other, he's okay and he's going to be okay. And it sounds like this is going to be okay. And I remember one of the biggest gifts is that I think I had talked to somebody who kind of had pushed me, and then we kind of went there as a couple. One day we were walking around the lake, and I kind of broke the ice and just kind of said, maybe he's going to die. And it was like the first time, and I mean, we were both thinking it, but we were afraid to say it to each other. We were afraid that she was afraid I would fall apart. And I was afraid my wife would fall apart. And I remember that day we just finally said it out loud, like, he may die. In hindsight, he, it was pretty, it had been hard to see it any other way than that he was going to die. But that being said, he lived 4 years after that. But the point I'm making is that after we finally got honest with those feelings and got honest with those fears, we finally it allowed us the freedom to be present with him again. I remember that night, like it was like such a relief that we kind of all got honest with what was really going on. We played a game, and it's almost like it released us because we had enough support that we felt like we could be honest with those emotions. We didn't have to hide. We knew people were there to pick us up if we fell. So I guess if I had any advice, it would be to make sure you try to find the support in whatever it is, whether it be therapy or friends or family, where you can get honest with those fears, because everybody knows you have them and nobody's going to hold them against you.
I think that that story is it appears to be so simple, right? That this is your wife, this is your partner, you should be able to talk about it. But the way that you described it, I know in my own journey, just being able to be honest for all the reasons why you said is the reason why we fear, of either us breaking down ourselves and not knowing if we can come back from it, or upsetting someone else, or them being mad, or whatever it is. And then but taking that risk to break that ice so that we can then deal with it for what it is. And it actually, after processing it through, actually becomes a gift and becomes relief.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that's with the COVID thing, that it's kind of that same mentality that, okay, I don't think I'm above getting sick, or that somehow, but it's like, all right, we could get sick, but for those of us that aren't, it's like, okay, what do I do with today then?
Yeah.
How do I get something out of this day? Like, I guess that's my challenge.
Yeah. And how do we live, right? It's different, right? But how do we still enjoy, have joy in today in the midst of these change and the different things going on? um, and so speaking of that, when we're inviting, um, the clients that we work with, and the people that we're around, as well as ourselves, we're inviting them into developing resiliency, right? Into this idea of that we all got thrust into this time period equally. We're all in this time period together. What would be some of the things that if you were going to throw out to somebody regarding this time period of resiliency development, right? So this is that difficult time that we're going to look back on at some point and go, yeah, this is where my skin grew a little bit thicker, or this is when I pivoted, kind of like what you were talking about in the 90s with a business or whatever. What would be some suggestions that you would give based upon what you went through with the business, what you went through with Ben, what you went through regarding recreating a career after farming? Those are three pretty significant time periods of your life. What would be a couple of things that you throw out regarding that resiliency and changing your stars?
I guess the one thing I would say is, like, embrace the uncomfortable as much as you don't want to. It's kind of like, okay, being honest, like I said before, this is uncomfortable, this is scary. But I would, almost every client that I've ever worked with or anybody I've ever talked to, like, has one of those resilient times already in their life, right? One of those, almost all of us have had a time where we had to endure something. And so looking at this as a time for growth instead of an ending,
Right.
looking at this as, yeah, it is scary and it's okay to be scared, but I don't have to be paralyzed if I'm not sick. It's like, it's having a plan, not just to hide or just a plan to stay away, but how can I have a plan to move forward? Okay, how are we going to talk to each other tomorrow? How am I going to, what do we talk about tomorrow to move this business forward? How do we, instead of sitting terrified, looking at each other with what we lost, what do I still have to gain? How can I grow from this? How can I, and I mean, I'm not sitting here by any means saying I was an expert. It's kind of like, I used to have people tell me all the time, how did you do it? Like, I could never get through that. I could have never gotten through losing a child. And I'd just be like, you just do,
Mhm.
and we will get through this. It may look a little different, but it's like, if I dwell on what I'm losing, then it continues to hurt me.
Mhm.
If my thinking is constantly in fear and constantly in what I may not get to have, then that joy just gets pushed out so much further.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like facing your fear, being honest, whatever you feel like you need to do to make appropriate steps to keep yourself and your family safe. But then, if I'm here and I'm still healthy, how do I get the most out of this day? How do I still salvage as much as I can of this day? Even though it might not be a great day, half of this day might have been terrifying, but I still have time to salvage something out of every day. And I feel like every day I get through a tough day, that's resiliency, right? Like, a lot of people, I don't think they're giving themselves credit. They've already been resilient.
Mhm.
They already got through some fears that they never thought they'd get through. So I don't know. I feel like it's kind of appropriate that it's at spring. Trees and flowers and grass, they always adapt, right? Like, if it's cold, they decide to grow this way. If it's warm, they decide to grow this way. Like, I feel like this is just part of all of us that are still alive through this time frame. We got to kind of figure out how to adapt.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting as I'm listening to you talk, and I know I've said, some of my listeners have heard me say this before, is that just as we think of three distinct time periods that you talked about today, with the business in the industry that you were in changing in the 90s, and in the 2000s with Ben being sick, and then later admitting and identifying that he was terminal, and then in the middle of the, like, 2014, 15, and 16, as you were doing double jobs and going to school and working and all that type of stuff. In those three time periods, those were hard times, fearful times, difficult times, and now they're a story that you talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, with this COVID going on and all the different changes that are happening and all the unknowns, we're in the middle of writing the story that later we're going to tell. There's going to be a story at some point that we're going to tell about how we act during this time period. What we do in this time period right now will be the story that we're going to tell in 6 months, in 9 months, in a year from now. And so, instead of being fearful just to be fearful and being paralyzed, we need to recognize, like you said, that we are afraid, but not drowned in that.
Right.
Acknowledge it, admit it, share it with someone, let the energy pass, and now what are we going to do with it?
Mm-hmm.
So, Jim, I appreciate you, and I appreciate Pat introducing us and you coming and being part of KP, but also being part of my life now. And I really appreciate that aspect, and I appreciate you having the courage to share your story today for everyone. If there's just one person, like you said, that can take a piece of it and say, if Jim can do that, then maybe I'll be able to do that too. If there's one thing that you wanted to leave the listeners with, what will be that one thing you'd want them to leave with?
I guess maybe the thing that I didn't talk about yet is, for me, faith is a huge part of it. I had to have God along the way, and I was angry at him a lot of times. And I think however you view your higher power or that part of your life, um, there's a there's a really valuable piece that comes with a surrender and vulnerability that I know I'm not running the show. I think for a lot of the beginning of my life, I was just sure I was running the show. and and I was terrified if I had ever thought I wasn't running the show.
Sure.
And I think God gave me a lesson that I still am thankful for, that I'm still going to keep fighting, and I don't expect things to just fall in my lap. but I'm not running the show, and I'll be okay if I just keep staying in my lane. I guess that would be what I would.
Sure. I think, Jim, when you talk about that is, I think that part of recognizing, for me, part of my experience with experiencing God is recognizing that I'm part of a bigger story, and it isn't all about me, which then technically makes me not God anymore. And so because I think I used to send prayers / memos to God to tell him what to do, and and then I was either pissed that he didn't do it, or I was grateful that he did. However that was. But I recognize now that 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 God allows me to recognize that I'm part of a bigger story, and I don't know what that outcome is going to be. I just got to do my part today.
Yeah. And maybe this COVID thing is going to help everybody be ready for the next chapter. We may not realize how important this is going to be to prepare us for some other day in our life.
Yeah, I agree. Jim, again, thank you very much for being on the show today, and I appreciate all the work that you do and you sharing your story. So,
I appreciate you, and I love being part of the KP team. So thank you too.
all right, you have a good night.
Yep, you too.